let's start for the third time. So would you agree with this statement that we all believe it's important to make good decisions and be ethical people? Now, we might disagree on what a good decision is or what it looks like to be an ethical person, but I think that we all have this belief that every single one of us has values, a certain set of values that drive and guide the decisions that we make. Now, again, we may not live consistently with those values that we have, but we have these values. And so here's the question that I want to address in today's show. It's this. Are the values that we hold dear, the ones that guide and inform the decisions that we make in life, are these mere social conventions? Meaning, is it the difference between driving on the right or left side of the road? Is it the difference between playing a sport and am I supposed to touch the ball with my hands or only touch it with my feet? Right? Are these just rules that we as humans have invented and created? Or maybe they're not just social conventions. Maybe it's the difference between mere expressions of personal preference, that you just like and don't like something like you like and don't like certain kinds of ice cream. Or when we talk about these values that we hold dear, are they actually valid independently of our apprehension of them? Are they actually valid independent of what we think and believe about them? And so then the question becomes, what is their foundation? If they exist outside of us, what is their foundation? Or another question, a way you could put it is, are these things that are there things that we should do and things that we should not do? And this is what I want to talk about in today's show. We're going to be walking through this book right here, Ethics and Moral Reasoning, a Student's Guide. And this is going to kind of drive our conversation on ethics and moral reasoning today as we try to really make sense of these ethical questions. And let me say this before I give you a couple of announcements and we jump into the topic, is as I was reading this short little booklet and then doing other studies and preparing for today's show, I was doing it all with a framework of all the moral questions that we have been having here on the show in the last few months. Even last week when Mirza called in and him and I had a great conversation, those sort of thoughts and challenges and objections were driving me as I was studying and researching. And so I hope that today's show kind of brings clarity on even some of the past conversations I've had, as I had quite a few aha moments in the last week where I'd be reading something and I go, oh yeah, I didn't address that very well, or I didn't really make that distinction that I think is helpful in this conversation. So I hope today's conversation is helpful. James, so good to see you here. Again, haven't seen you a little bit. Lance, welcome. Mirza, thanks for being here. And Dad, thanks for being here as well. And sorry, everyone on Instagram that had to come over from Instagram. I can't stream to two places at once today. Who knows? All right. So before we jump into the topic, let me again just kind of give you a brief overview of what's going to be happening here on the show in future weeks and maybe give you a reason to like and subscribe and follow the content. So we are in part one. Today is going to be part one of a worldview study that I'm doing, walking through this series, Reclaiming the Christian Intellectual Tradition. I'll tell you more about this after my quick announcements as we jump into the series. Next week, which is January 28, I'm going to be having a conversation with Dr. Fazal Rana on the scientific evidence for Adam and Eve and human origins. He contributed to this book, Who Was Adam, with Hugh Ross. He also wrote a shorter section in this book, The Comprehensive Guide to Science and Faith, on the scientific evidence for Adam and Eve. So next week is going to be a fun conversation on the science of human origins. That one should be one you want to check out. The first one in February 4, is going to be part one of my apologetics study this year that I'm going to be doing. Again, this year is 3 different studies: worldview, apologetics, culture, 1 topic per month. And so part 1 is an introduction to natural theology with Dr. Charles Taliaferro. He wrote chapter 1 of this large book that I'm going to be working through this year on natural theology by William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland. He also contributed to a 5 views book on natural theology published by Baker Academic. So that's going to be February 4. February 11, and by the way, all these shows are Tuesday at 1:30 p.m. Pacific time. Tuesday is going to be part 2 of our culture series. We're walking through this book, What Do I Say When? A Parent's Guide to Navigating Cultural Chaos for Children and Teens by Andrew and Christian Walker. Chapter 2, part 2 is going to be on abortions. That is February 11. And then, where's my last one? Here it is. Then we're back to actually this study, Worldview Part 2. This was voted on through Instagram. So if you want to have an opinion on what comes up next, go follow on Instagram, Ryan Pauly 3. And Part 2 of our Worldview study is going to be looking at the great tradition of Christian thinking. So that is February 18. So those are the next 4 studies: Apologetics Part 1, Culture Part 2, and Worldview Part 2, as well as Human Origins. Now, before that also, I do want to remind you, if you live in the Southern California area, I'm going to be speaking at the Maven Conference on February 22nd. It's a one-day, all-day conference down near Laguna Hills, Laguna Beach, Laguna Niguel, somewhere around there. And so if you're in the Orange County, Southern California area, I mean, even Los Angeles and San Diego, I want to encourage you to make it out to that conference. It's a one-day conference, morning to afternoon, a lot of great speakers. I'm going to be speaking in the student track. So the breakout sections have different tracks on culture, science, students, and parents. And so I'm going to be speaking in the first part of student track, focusing on how do we live a moral life in an immoral culture. So I want to encourage you to check out mavenconferences.com for more information there. And then as well as my work with Maven, this summer, July 27 to August 2nd, I'm leading an open enrollment immersive experience to Utah. So if you want to come join us in training and preparing and deepening your understanding of Christian and Mormon theology, as well as going out to Utah, July 27 to August 2nd, this trip is available for everyone going into high school or into college, as it is a student trip, and you can join me in Utah. So I haven't really talked about that on the show ever before, not since last year, I guess. And so, hey, if you want to sign up, more information can be found at maventruth.com. Go to the open enrollment or go to immersive experiences tab and then go to open enrollment. So I can put more information down in the description below on YouTube. So I think that's all my announcements. So let's jump into the conversation today. So this book, actually, let me take a step back really quickly. This series that we're working through on natural theology, on too many series, on Worldview is coming from this series on reclaiming the Christian intellectual tradition. I want to give you just a very brief overview of what this series is, since this is part one. It's kind of an introduction to the series as well. Here it says on the back of the book, the Reclaiming the Christian Intellectual Tradition series is designed for Christian students and those associated with college campuses, including faculty, staff, and trustees. These guidebooks address the common challenges in major academic disciplines by reclaiming the best of the Christian intellectual tradition, demonstrating that vibrant, world-changing Christianity assumes a commitment to the integration of faith and scholarship. With illustrations, reflection questions, and a list of resources for further study, this series is sure to be a timely tool in both Christian and secular universities, influencing the next generation of leaders in the church and academy and the world. And so this really is a 16-part series that we're going to be working through probably for the next 2 years, looking at a wide range of issues like arts and entertainment and media and philosophy and theology and apologetics, all sorts of different things. And really trying to look at how has Christian scholarship informed, or how does it speak into these areas? How does a Christian worldview see these different areas? So it's going to be a fun series. Now, this part on ethics and moral reasoning, every booklet has a different author, is authored by C. Ben Mitchell, who is a PhD from the University of Tennessee. He holds the Graves Chair of Moral Philosophy at Union University in Tennessee and serves as the editor of Ethics and Medicine, an international journal of bioethics. He is the author of numerous scholarly articles and has contributed to a number of books. And so that is who is the author here. So again, I requested this from Crossway, and they said, hey, if you want to chat about it, we'll send you a copy. So here I am chatting about it because I think this is something worth chatting about. And so I actually reject most requests I get from people to say, hey, I wrote a book. Can I come on your show and talk about it? Most of those I say no to. Only when I think it actually does have value do I say, sure, come on the show, or I'll take that book and I'll do a quick review of the book on the show. So what he does is he kind of looks at this in a few different parts. And so I want to walk through this as quickly as I can. As always, I want to get to your questions at the end. So I want to try to go about 30 minutes as fast as I can, and then get to the questions that you have. And then as always, you can call in as well. The link there is at the top. I forgot to pin it. So let me pin it at the top so it doesn't go away. There it is. Okay. So he addresses, he kind of walks through ethics and moral reasoning in 6 chapters. He talks about the challenges of living in a relativistic world of moral relativism. He then looks at 2 different parts of the history of moral reasoning. He then looks at Enlightenment ethics, evangelical ethics, and then how do we use the Bible in our decision making. So in chapter 1 is his approach to, or his comments about relativism. And what he recognizes is this: we live in a society that often renders moral judgments about behavior. I mean, this is super common. We live in a society that has this kind of deeply held belief about morality. When we see people doing things that they should not be doing, we render moral judgments. Hey, that's wrong. You shouldn't do that. We live in a society that has these sort of moral judgments. At the same time, we also live in a society that talks about morals being relativistic, meaning they change from culture to culture, they change from person to person. And so the question is, can we actually have a sense of objective or unchanging moral standards or moral virtues or moral duties within this sort of framework of relativism that we lead? Now, here was the first aha moment I had as I was thinking about my conversation like last week with Mirza and then reading this book, is he says this. Actually, that's not where he says that. That is where he says it. Well, here's what he says is important. Where did he say it? Oh no, I thought I had it highlighted somewhere. Maybe it's going to come up at some point. But here's what he says. If relativism is true, it then means that the search for some sort of enduring universal moral norms is futile. It's a waste of time to talk about and look for these sort of enduring, objective, universal moral norms if moral norms are not universal or enduring or objective. However, here it is, the aha moment. He says, but the fact that we live in a relativistic world also means that if relativism is not true, we need to know how to respond to a view that is so pervasive in our culture. And he says this, he goes, we live in a relativistic world. And that caught me off guard for a second. I went, wait a second. What do you mean we live in a relativistic world? Aren't you going to be defending objective morality? And here's what I thought was fascinating. And this is going to come up a few different times in different ways throughout the show today, is that we live in a relativistic world because our world and how it is functioning sees morality as relativistic. And so this is how we are operating. This is how we are living. The question though is the world relativistic? Is that how it actually is? Right. And this has come up in conversations past where it's like we live in a world that believes that, the earth is the center of our solar system. And so everything we teach and do and how we operate is going to be grounded around that principle. But the question is, well, is the earth really the center of the solar system? Right. That's the question. And so I think it's interesting when objections come up and says, but look at culture. Our culture looks relativistic. Our culture is changing morality. Morality does change. And you look at these sort of laws and standards of how we live and operate is changing or is different from person to person. As one person says, sex inside of marriage or outside of marriage is bad. Another person says it's perfectly fine. Or drunkenness is wrong. Another person says, I don't care. Get drunk. It doesn't matter. And it's saying, yeah, we see this because our world is operating as if relativism is true. The question is it really? And so I think when we point to our culture and say, look, see, this is happening. It's like, yeah, because we live in a relativistic world. That's how we operate. And that's why we see these sort of things. The question is it true? And can we still kind of find issues with it? And so here's what I think is kind of the big kind of first aha moment. Now I titled the thumbnail of this video as the 5 kind of problems, I forget how I put it exactly, with moral relativism. And this is how he kind of starts off and says, okay, we live in this relativistic world where everyone believes that morality is relative. If that is true, then it kind of creates these problems. And so here are the 5 problems that he lays out with moral relativism. And I've discussed some of these things on the show before. He says, number 1, if morality is relative, then what is right in one group is not necessarily right in another group or could be wrong in another group, right? If morality changes from group to group or person to person, then what is right for one person could be wrong for another. And so then a question becomes, what happens when we live in multiple groups? What ought we do? So if my church functions one way, but my school functions another way, and my school says one thing is right, and my church says another, and that thing is actually wrong, and these are my 2 different groups, we now can be caught in a middle ground where we ask, okay, well then what now am I supposed to do when 2 different groups or 2 different spheres that I exist inside of disagree about this moral issue? Do I just pick and choose, or is there an actual way to adjudicate? Is there a way to actually look at these 2 different issues and try to come to a conclusion of which one is right and which one is wrong? And so the problem with relativism is that we all live within multiple groups, and those groups often have different views of morality And so that can lead to a sense of confusion of, now, what am I supposed to do? And therefore, while morality may be group to group or culture to culture, it ultimately, I think, kind of boils down to this relativistic, individualistic moral sense where it's, well, this is what I think, and this is true because that's what I think so. The second problem with moral relativism that he lays out here is that moral error is not possible if relativism is true. You cannot make a moral error. And so if morality changes from person to person, you can't say, Ryan, you're wrong. And I've talked about this many times on the show before, is you can't say, Ryan, you made an error. It's not like math. You got this wrong. This is an error. You need to fix it. It's, hey, I don't like it. I don't prefer this. I wish that you didn't do it. But you can't actually say that someone is wrong. Number three, and I've brought this up many times, so I think this is a really interesting point. If relativism is true, the problem this creates is that there's no place for moral reformers within relativism. You can't have moral reform because moral reformers assumes that you're reforming, that you're fixing something broken and getting better. So people like JFK, we just celebrated that, who ended segregation or fought to end segregation as being some sort of wrong in culture. Well, it wasn't actually wrong. And so we're not fixing things, we're simply changing. And so we recognize that this sort of moral reform and these reformers who we often have holidays about, and Harold is doing something amazing. They didn't actually do anything amazing. They created a change, but there was no moral reform. It's just we live and act differently today. Now, I think if you could take this one step further, what I've talked about is that if there's no moral reformers, and if the law is what creates morality, whatever's legal becomes right, then all moral reformers by definition are immoral. So I think this creates a problem. Number four is that he talks about how morality or relativism suffers from a fundamental philosophical problem. And here's one that I haven't thought about as much before. Here's how he gets it. And we've talked about this a little bit on the show, but I think in a different way than I've thought about. He says, within this fundamental philosophical problem of relativism is that there is this objective ought, this should, this thing that we should do when it claims that morality differs from person to person, that this is the way things ought to be. We say, well, how should things function? Well, things should be different, right? This is how it ought to be. We ought to respect everyone else's moral views. And so this actually believes that there is a foundational objective ought, and that ought is you should recognize everyone's going to have a different view and respect their different views that they have. And so there is still a fundamental ought within a system that is talking about that there are no objective oughts, if that makes sense. Now, what I have talked about on the stroke before, or on the show, I think I just read James, your comment on where it says stroke, and then I said stroke instead of show. What I've talked about on the show before is that we cannot derive an ought from an is. So just because something is a certain way doesn't mean it should be that way. Right? Just because we did practice slavery, that's what was true, doesn't mean that ought to be true. We should be slaves. Just because in Germany they did kill Jews doesn't mean we ought to kill Jews, right? We recognize you can't get an ought from an is. And so just because something is one way does not mean that's how it should be. And so the question within moral relativism is it seems to say, no, morality changes. There are no objective duties that we have. There's no objective values that we have. But within that system, there seems to be something that says, and this is the way things ought to be. The way it ought to be is to say that there are no oughts, if that makes sense. And so he talks about this philosophical problem that I think is interesting to kind of tease out a little bit. Number five, and I can pause here if you want to have comments specifically on these 5 problems that he lays out. Put a Q in the comment section before your comment, so I know it's addressed to me. But number 5 is it says, and I think this is a key point in where I've missed a lot of the previous conversations, that relativism fails to distinguish between moral practices and the values that underwrite them. I think this is a hugely important point, that it fails to distinguish between moral practices and the values that underwrite them. So as I'll talk about later on in the show, if you look at a moral argument for God's existence, it says that without God, that you cannot have objective moral values and duties, that you can't have objective moral values and duties. And what often happens was when Christians talk about there being objective morality, or objective moral values and duties, the objection often comes up and says, well, hold on, but there's all these different moral practices. People practice different things, and that's true. But where relativism fails, according to this section, is that it fails to distinguish between moral practices and the values that underwrite them. For example, he says, some cultures think that showing the bottom of your foot is offensive. Others think that shaking with the right hand is offensive. Others think that flipping up your middle finger is offensive. And so the practice is different from culture to culture. And we see there's differences among all the cultures. But the value that undergirds all of it is that we should respect others, that it's wrong to offend. Now, what might offend is different, but there's a moral value of we should value people, and therefore to do these certain practices is offensive, and therefore those become wrong. Well, another way of putting this is that we often confuse a subjective origin for our moral judgments and the objective value to which the judgments refer. So we have subjective origins where my preference or my opinion or these sort of things, or we have certain ideas or laws in culture that say, hey, you should drive on the right side, or you should stop at red lights, or you should not show the bottom of your foot, or you should do this. And there's so these different subjective origins where we can point to social constructions where society has created this thing that is offensive or that is wrong or whatever. But we can't confuse that from the objective value in which those judgments refer. We value human life, and so we are going to do A, B, or C. We value respecting individuals, and therefore you can't do A, B, or C, and that may be different from culture to culture. Here's how William Lane Craig puts it in his book, Reasonable Faith. He says this: just because the origin of our moral judgments can be historically or sociologically explained does not mean that there are no objective corresponding values in reality. And so I think this was kind of an aha moment for me, is the issue with often relativism is relativism points to the fact that there are different moral practices and says, see, morality is relative. Versus I think when we dig below the surface, while we may see different moral practices, or while we may see moral judgments that is historically or sociologically grounded or explained, we see this objective value that it is based upon, like human beings are valuable, life is valuable. And so this idea that we should do good because it's good and we should not do evil. And so, well, even he says here in this section that each one on its own may not be a big issue. When you look at all five of these together, that we recognize this does become an argument, at least, against relativism. Now, this is where I think it's interesting, is kind of taking a step back, and then I'll kind of work through the rest of the book somewhat quickly, hopefully, and then get to your questions as quickly as I can, although I've only been going like 13 minutes, which is pretty good. And the question here is, when you have competing views of reality. So the Christian says morality is objective. There are objective moral values and duties, which we'll talk about in a moment. And the secularist says, no, there is no objective morality. Morality is relative. It changes from person to person or culture to culture. The question is, can we prove one way or another? Can we prove it? But then also, are there defeaters against certain views? Now, when you look at kind of a history of Christian reasoning, William Sorley talks about this idea that the reality has an objective moral order. But then he says you cannot prove that objective values exist. You can't prove it. And then he says, but in the same sense, how you can't prove that the external world exists, right? And I often would do this joke with my students where I would say, prove to me that you existed more than 5 minutes ago, with, that you've been living for more than 5 minutes. And they would say, I have memories in my head from 10 years ago. And I say, well, those were memories implanted in your head. And they say, well, I got food in my stomach from lunch I ate an hour ago. Well, you were created with that food in your stomach. And the question is this: can you prove beyond all reasonable doubt that you've existed for more than 5 minutes? And the answer is no, you can't prove it. Now, do you have any good reason though to believe it? And the issue is, yes, that contradicts all of our basic awareness and experiences that we have in life. And so here's the question. Do you have defeaters or challenges for me to question those experiences? When I have experiences and memories and all the things that have taken place in my life to give me every reason to believe that I've existed for more than 5 minutes, that I had a childhood and I lived 10 years ago and 15 years ago, do you have an argument against that rather than just saying, well, you can't prove to me that you existed longer? Well, you're right. I can't prove to you I've existed longer than 5 minutes. But do you have any reason for me to question my basic sense experience? William Sorley gives a similar argument for morality, that just like we can assume the external world is real, even though it could all be a simulation and we live inside of a matrix, just like we assume that we had a childhood, even though it could all just be a creation of this matrix world that we live in, the question is, do we have any good reason to doubt our basic sense awareness? Same is true with morality. We all have this ingrained moral sense. And the question is, well, I may not be able to prove that to you. Do we have defeaters or good reasons to question that basic moral sense that we have and that basic moral sense that we are built in with and ingrained with? So that's kind of the first thing, is to recognize, like, here are 5 potential defeaters of relativism that a relativist, if their view is true, would have to come back and have a response to and say, no, hey, here's how I think this works. And here's how we make sense of it within relativism. Now you might say, well, no, yeah, you're right. There is no moral error. You're right. There is no moral reformers. You're right. It does create a philosophical problem because we can't get an ought from an is. All you can say is what is. You can't have any sort of objective oughts. And all we have are moral practices. There are no objective values. Someone may say that. And then the question is, okay, now how can you prove that? What reasons do you have for holding those views? Because those views that there's no objective moral values, there's no good, there's no bad, there's no right, there's no wrong, there's no moral reformers, there's no moral errors. It's all just preference and opinion. Like, that goes against everything that we are aware of and how we operate and how we speak and how we interact with one another. So I think these are some big problems that have to be addressed. Now, I said I would get to questions, and I think I saw a couple questions that did come in. There's a lot of comments coming on in the live chat, which I appreciate. Thanks for being here, everybody. Mirza says, do you believe in evolution? So not in a universal common ancestry sense of evolution, not a Darwinian sense of evolution. I believe that creatures have the ability to adapt to their environment. I think that there's natural selection acting upon random genetic mutations. I just don't think that that can produce the diversity of life that we see today. Let's see. Mirza also says, relative morality is not the same as arbitrary morality. Maybe morality is not an end in itself, but a means to an end. Maybe morality exists for the benefit of people and is not the thing in itself. So I would say this, it doesn't necessarily, well, let me put it this way. If there's not an external standard or an external foundation for morality that exists outside of us, then in one sense it is arbitrary. How is it not? If morality simply is the preference and opinions of people, and those opinions have no sort of objective values for which they're founded upon, then how is it not arbitrary by people deciding, here's what I like and here's what I don't like, or here's what I think is good or bad? If we're going to argue that morality is a means to an end, that there's this end goal that is an objectively good thing, like human flourishing, or human value, or survival, then we're saying, okay, there is a value independent of what you think, and that is that survival is good, death is bad. You now have an objective value. And therefore, actions that help survival, generally speaking, would be good, and actions that go against survival would be bad. If survival of the species is an objective value within your system. And so if that's your view, then you're no longer a relativist. And so that's where I think that if you're truly a relativist and there's not even an objective end value or goal, any sort of purpose that we're shooting for, and there's no objective value by which it's grounded upon, then I don't see how it's not arbitrary within that view. Benefit. We say that morality maybe exists for the benefit of people. We use that word benefit as if benefiting is good and harming is bad. Right? Where do we get this idea that benefit is good, harm is bad? Is it a value that life is good, love is good, things that benefit are good, independent of what you think about it? So again, these are the underlying values that are informing those things. And if we believe that there's benefit, that is the third problem with relativism. If relativism is true, there is no moral reform. Therefore, there is no benefit. There is no moral changes that help. And therefore, we can't say, hey, this is how it benefits. So I think that's the issue with relativism. And so I would say, no, there is an objective morality. Are you using the fallacy of extremes? Just because nothing can be proven doesn't mean that everything is possible. So I'm not using that sort of fallacy. I'm just saying, while I cannot prove something, it doesn't mean it's possible. But the question is this: is there reasons to deny our sense experience? Are there reasons to deny our awareness of what is taking place? And again, when I have memories and I have a childhood and I have all of these things to get me to believe that I actually lived a life and I wasn't created 5 minutes ago, unless you can provide me some good defeaters against the view that I had a childhood, I think I am morally, I'm justified in believing that I did have a childhood. That's the point. It's not just because you can't prove it, anything's possible. But the question is, if I can't prove to you that my childhood existed, you could always say, well, what about? Just like I may not be able to prove to you that morality is objective. Well, you could say, what about? But unless there's defeaters against a view, the question is, are we justified in believing it? James says, what side of the dilemma, the Euthyphro dilemma, do you take? Well, neither side. I think that we split the harms. I take the normal Christian position. The Euthyphro dilemma for everybody is is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it is good? The first one says, well, then the command is arbitrary because God could command whatever he wants, and he could make something right and he could make something wrong, and therefore it's right and wrong. And so it's arbitrary on whatever God wants to do. The other side of the Euthyphro dilemma says, or there's a standard outside of God that his commands have to follow, and therefore there's a higher standard of morality above God that he is subservient to. And the Euthyphro dilemma has historically been split to say this is a false dilemma. It's not an either or, right? A false dilemma is saying, well, did he walk to the store or did he ride his bike to the store? And it's like, well, neither one. He drove a car to the store. And the question is there a third option here? And so I would split the Euthyphro dilemma and say, God commands something because he is good. His nature is the standard for goodness. God is love. And therefore the moral commands that flow from him are to love your neighbor as yourself, to pray for those that persecute, to love your enemy, to care for those. And this then informs a moral value that love is good, hate is bad. And then our moral actions are grounded upon that or reflective of that, as then loving people generally is a good thing. And when you hurt them and harm them, that's a bad thing. And so that's how I would make sense of the Euthyphro dilemma. Travis says, why are there so few Christians in this apologetics chat? That's a great question. I've always wondered. Christians, where are you at? You know, I love that so many atheists are here. Like Mirza and Lou and James and Travis. And I'm sorry, Lance, you're new, so I don't know what your view is, but all of you who come week after week, man, I so appreciate it. And I say this all the time, and I honestly mean it, is that I really appreciate the pushback and the questions, because I don't want to just spit my words off into a vacuum and believe they're true because I have a bunch of Christians. Yes, that's amazing. That's what I love about my time is teaching. In my time teaching, I taught majority non-Christians, and I taught apologetics and theology. And man, the pushback was so good and helpful at having to think through the challenges and objections, and rather than just living in this echo chamber where everyone agrees. And so I appreciate it. But at the same time, I do wonder, hey, Christians, where are you at? Where's the questions and digging deeper here? All right. A lot of questions are coming in. Let me kind of jump back. Let me jump back to this book. So there he lays out some problems with relativism. Now, he then moves into a history of moral reasoning. And so in chapter 2, he looks at the Old Testament and how really our moral reasoning, people want to say, well, the Bible's not relevant today. How does Christianity inform our moral reasoning? Well, because we live in a society that really is strongly influenced by Scripture and by Christian ideas. Our understandings of marriage and family go all the way back to Genesis chapter 1, where we recognize God creating men and women for the purpose of marriage, and the two become one flesh. And I get our cultures in a push against that, but historically, we've held to a very much a biblical view of Christianity. We see labor and vocation, that God created Adam to work, that work is good. It's good to have a calling and a work and not to be lazy. We recognize in our culture, laziness is bad, right? The person just sitting there asking for money, it's like, well, if you could work instead, why? I get it if there's an issue, but we recognize the beauty and the goodness of work. And we see that all the way back in the Genesis account, where God gave Adam work to do before the fall. This isn't a result of the fall. He talks about the sanctity and dignity of human life. We talked about that last week. That in the Genesis account, in Genesis 1:27, all humans created in the image of God, therefore have value and dignity. And we recognize that today. And that then speaks into issues like infanticide, where the Christians stood against infanticide in the early first century, where the Romans and other cultures around the world have practiced this idea of infanticide, and especially if it's a girl, because girls are not as valuable as boys, and we just leave them out to die. And the Christians are the ones that came along and said, hold on, everyone, the young and the old and the weak and the strong and male and female, all of people are valuable and have human dignity, and therefore we're called to protect all life. This led Christians to be against all the gladiatorial brutality of the early first century, where they actually talked about boycotting the gladiator games in a culture that didn't see any problem with gladiator games because, hey, you are a criminal, you're a prisoner, why not just expose you or use you for our entertainment? Christians have stood up for gender equality. That no, it doesn't matter if you're male or female. We see this in Galatians 3:28. There's neither Jew nor Greek, male or slave, free or slave, male or female, all are one in Christ Jesus. Now, this doesn't remove gender completely. It's not saying those don't exist, because they do. The issue is it doesn't matter. You are one, you have value, you have dignity. This has led to Christians holding to racial equality. Now, have all Christians done this? No. But the point here is this: because morality is not relative, when people don't hold to racial equality and instead are racist, or when people don't hold to gender equality and instead are misogynistic or whatever, then we can actually say that's wrong. That what you're doing is inconsistent because the way that you live actually contradicts the way it should be. He then has a whole section on the 10 Commandments and how those have led to be really a principle for modern laws today, where it talks about, that you should not steal, assumes that there's private property. And really it's fascinating. And I want to just kind of commend this whole section to you if you want to kind of check out this moral history, or this history of moral thinking, and how the 10 Commandments and the Old Testament really play a significant role. He then gets into the New Testament and the person of Jesus, and how Western culture and Western morality has been profoundly influenced by the person of Jesus and his Sermon on the Mount, right? Blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek, blessed are the hungry, those who thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the merciful, the pure in heart, peacemakers. We recognize these are good, virtuous things that often provide a foundation for how we live and think. He says here that the Beatitudes therefore describe the virtues and character for those whom the long-awaited Messiah has come. And so we see these ethics being poured out and taught throughout Jesus and the person or within the New Testament. Then from within this, we see this virtue ethics and natural law ethics start to kind of take form. And so we have, as early as the mid 300s BC with Greek philosophers of Aristotle and Plato, and different philosophers start speaking into these ideas of ethics and virtue ethics and natural law. And what does that mean for us? He talks about here that Aquinas, Catholic theologian Aquinas, saw laws versus virtues, and these natural goods, these things that are good, that Aquinas saw this, what he called the gradation of values, meaning there are things that are more true than others or more noble than others. There are things that are better than others. And so there's this graduation of values. And so if something can be better than something else or more true than something else, then there must be the truest, the best, what it should be. And so we recognize within this system, I think one thing that almost everyone can agree upon is one of the first and primary principles of natural law and virtue ethics is the statement, what is good ought to be pursued, what is bad avoided. Now, again, we may disagree a little bit on what it means for something to be good and what it means for something to be avoided. He says here, if one knows what the words good and bad mean in the ordinary language, then anyone can know this principle to be true, that we have a moral duty to pursue good and avoid bad. And this is something that we can use our awareness to recognize. Now, it's because of this, then, that we recognize that there's this moral good, and it's not based on a matter of the law, but there are principles that we can reason to that show that this is evident to everyone. Now, this is also then the difference between a moral action and the values that undergird it. He points back to Aquinas to talk about how the principles of practical reason are available and self-evident to everyone. And he gives this example. In some U.S. states, motorcyclists must wear helmets when riding their bikes, but not all all states have chosen the same requirement. This is merely a matter of law, a legal convention. So whether you wear a helmet or not, that's a matter of law. That's a legal convention. That is something that we invented. However, he says, the notion that life is a basic good does not depend on a convention, nor is it only true in some states and another. The fact that life is a good, right, over death is not just a human convention. It doesn't depend from state to state. And so we all know the truth of the matter through practical reason, which all of us share. Human life is a basic good, not least because without life, existence is impossible. Thus, life is a natural good. And therefore, we then create laws to protect life. Now, does everyone have the same law to protect that life? No. And so that's where laws, our social conventions, are created and do change, whether you have to wear a helmet or not, but it's based on that virtue. The practical good is life. Now, this I think is interesting. This then leads into that comment I made earlier. So what is seen most clearly then is this idea that we all share that we ought to pursue good and avoid bad. And if that is an ought that transcends not just my personal opinion, but if we recognize deep down, like, yes, I agree that we should pursue good. Now we're going to disagree on what good and bad is, but we recognize, yeah, we should pursue good. And if you're pursuing bad, that's bad. Then we can actually call stuff evil. That requires an objective standard. This then is what led, he talks about Martin Luther King Jr. in his letter from the Birmingham jail to say this: how does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? Now, again, I think if relativism is true, you can't say laws are just or unjust because there's nothing to compare it to. It's just what the law is. He says, though, a just law is man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. So I think within a Christian view that holds to objective moral values and duties, we then have a way to judge laws as being just and unjust based on how do they reflect or protect the good and avoid bad. And if a law is promoting bad and avoiding good, we can say that is unjust, that is not right, because the human life has value. Therefore, laws that protect human life are good, and laws that hurt human life are bad, like slavery, for instance. Now, he goes into this idea, and I think this is fascinating, and hopefully this is still interesting. You guys are sticking with me. He says some Protestant Christians are very, while appreciative of the contribution of natural law thinking, are actually against it or worry about it because it thinks that natural law arguments don't take seriously enough the effects of human sinfulness on our perception and our moral blindness as a result from sin. So I, not frequently, but every now and then I go live on TikTok before it was banned and then unbanned. And on Friday night, just a few days ago, I was live on TikTok, and a Christian called in to get my thoughts on how he talks to atheists. And he said, this is how I would respond to this argument. Curious what you think. And we chatted for a little bit, and it got to the point where this Christian said, non-Christians cannot be good. Non-Christians cannot love, they cannot be good, and they cannot do any good at all. Everything is evil all the time. And I said, whoa, hold on a second. Like, what do you mean by that? And he goes, look, they are not good people. The scripture is clear. No one is good but God. And so you're not a good person. Therefore, you can't do good and you can't love. Now, I reject this idea and I push back against it. He said, well, look, scripture says your good deeds are like filthy rags. And I responded, I said, well, but it says good deeds are like filthy rags. What that is teaching is that your good can't earn your salvation, or that good deeds can't make you good, but it doesn't say you can't do good. And he says, no, because you can't become good. You can't earn your salvation. You need Jesus. Therefore, you can't do good. And so I think what he was emphasizing is similar to what I read here, of that some Christians believe that our sinfulness and our brokenness and fallenness has corrupted us so horribly that we can't use human reason, we can't use intellect, we can't even use natural law, and we definitely can't do good because we are so horribly broken. And I think personally, this takes a more extreme view than we should when it comes to the image of God in us. That God created us in his image, that he gave us minds that we can think and process and be aware. And because of God's image in us and God's common grace that he has poured out over all of us, I think that while we cannot be inherently good, that we are inherently broken, we can still do good. And we can still use our mind to reason to true things, even though we are deceived and we are sinful and we are often mistaken. I'm not perfect, but the question is, can I believe or do anything right? And so I would say, look, and I asked him this question. I said, is life good? Well, yes. And I said, so is protecting or saving life good? Well, yeah. Can a non-Christian save someone's life? Yes. So then wouldn't it be good when a non-Christian saves someone's life? And he goes, well, from our perspective, it is, but not from God's, because they're not good. And so obviously there's a breakdown in communication. So definitely there are Christians that believe this. I would not be one. I do think that natural law arguments are good arguments, that we can actually reason and use our minds because God has created everyone in the image of God. All of us have the ability to think and reason. Well, it is broken in some sense. It is not completely lost. And therefore, I think we can reason with people and come to these sort of conclusions. Now, he addresses, I got two more kind of points left. He then jumps over to the Enlightenment Ethics, and how a lot of people throughout the Enlightenment try to create these sort of objective or at least ethical ways of reasoning and making decisions without attributing or pointing to any sort of God or transcendent moral reality. Utilitarianism would be one. The idea that rightness and wrongness determined by the goodness or badness that results as follows. And he asks, I think, some interesting questions to kind of challenge us or think about it. He says, okay, well, if this is true, that what is right and wrong is based on the greatest good for the greatest number of people, the two issues is, number one, then we can't actually know what is moral when we're making a choice because we don't always know how our choice is going to affect someone. And so before you make a decision, you can't actually know whether there's going to be a goodness or badness that results. And so then there's no way to have any sort of moral decision making because you don't know the future. He also asked another interesting question that I never considered, but the question is this, is how far into the future must we account for? Because as we are all aware of, we do some things and it has an immediate positive, and then all of a sudden we realize the negative comes. And so the question is, how long do we have to wait to see the effects of the decision that we made before we can know if what we actually did was right or wrong? And so there's some issues here. So he talked about these ethical theories within Enlightenment ethics that are focused on action-based ethics. They lack a motivational component to really motivate you to be good, to actually do what's right. It's often this idea of just don't harm anyone, just don't hurt anybody. Or as I talked about last week, like with sexual ethics and consent is important and good, but it's like, if that's all we have, it's like, well, as long as you don't rape anyone, we're good. Like, where's the motivation to actually be good rather than just don't harm? Right? If all we have in culture is just don't hurt people, you can wish whatever you want, you can think whatever you want, just don't hurt them. There's no motivation to actually be good and to do positive duty things like love and compassion. And that's the other issue, is that it ignores the spiritual dimensions of being grateful, of having self-respect, of being compassionate, and it just focused on the actions. It also really overemphasizes, and I think that relativism does the same, autonomy over the communal content of ethics. It's often really what we hear a lot in our society and our culture today, where the definition of good is, I approve this. I approve it, and therefore it's good. Very rarely do we recognize some sort of standard outside of us. So last point here is on Christian ethics. And that Christian ethics should not just be concerned about do's and don'ts. He says the first task for us is to rightly envision the world, right? And then to live in a way that rightly envisions the world, and seeing how do we use it. And I talk about that a lot, where we see what is this made for, and then how do I use it for that purpose? It's not just do's and don'ts. Don't do this and do this. It's how should I do this? What is this created for, and how do I use it in a way that causes its flourishing? He says that some Christians see the Bible just as a law code. But he says the problem with this view, if we look at the Bible just as a bunch of laws, is that the Bible is much more than just a book of rules. It's not just a rule book. And also, why read it every day if it's just a rule book? That's weird. We don't do that with rule books. Some people see the Bible, it's just a bunch of universal principles. It's just biblical material is to view it as a source of principles to be discerned through ethical decision making. He says the issue, though, with this is that the Bible does give us much more than just simply ethical principles. There's biblical teachings about ethics. There are persons that we are called to model. There are virtues that are called to be lived and to followed. It's not just simply ethical principles. Some people say, well, the Bible is just a community narrative. He says, well, the problem is the Bible does contain rules like the Ten Commandments and others. And so it's not just simply a narrative that we find our position in. And so what he argues for in the last part of this book is that the Bible is a canonical revelation of divine commands, principles, and Christian virtues. That it's canonical, it's part of the Christian scripture, that it's God's revelation, that God has made himself known, and this is how he has communicated to us. Then his moral instructions come to us in the form of commands and principles that are revealed in Christian virtues and examples. We see these through things like commands against anger and lust and divorce and taking oaths and retaliation. Positively, we see Jesus giving commands to his disciples to love their enemies, to give to those in need, to pray for the single-heartedly, fast, store up treasures for heaven, in heaven, not on earth. There's also the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. All of these we recognize are these values that we should be striving to make sense of. And so that is what he then points to, is recognizing these deep values that we all recognize. When we see tragedy in the world, we recognize that's not the way the world should be. It's not the way it ought to be. Something has gone wrong. Something is broken. That person is not valuing life, because we recognize life is something to value. To when someone doesn't value it, we push against it. And so that points to these sort of underlying objective values and duties. Now, my one pushback or complaint about this book, and I'm about ready to take your calls, and it gives me about 30 or so minutes to take your calls. If you have calls, so you can call in and get in the line. And if there's more callers, get yourself in the queue. If I'm talking to a caller, don't think that you can't call in. You can get yourself in the queue, and I can take your call when that one's done. Is this book really did live up to its description of painting the Christian intellectual history of here's how the Christian worldview sees this, competing against other worldviews? What it didn't really do is it didn't make an apologetic. There's no argument for objective morality in this book. There's no, here's the way it should be, or here's how you actually do an apologetic and build a case for God's existence based on morality. It really is just simply, here is how Christians have thought about morality throughout culture. It's more of a historical view, which I think is really helpful. As hopefully I've convinced you, there's some really interesting points that can help us as we make conversations. And so what I want to do here really quick, and I keep saying really quick and then realizing there's other points, is what is then an argument for objective morality? Now, when we talk about objective morality, we recognize this. The moral argument would say if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist, right? When we speak of objective moral values and duties, those are different. An objective moral value is whether something is good or bad. When we talk about moral duties, we're talking about what is right and wrong, or our moral obligations. And we know that we're not obligated to do something just because it's good. Right? It's good to be a teacher. That doesn't mean all of us are obligated to become teachers. Being a doctor is a good thing, and helping people is a good thing. Does that mean that all of us are obligated to be doctors? Of course not. So there's a difference between something is a good, and therefore you are obligated to do it, right? And so there's a difference between our obligations, or our moral duties, and then what is a moral value. Now, the question then becomes, and was often discussed on the show, and challenge is brought up to me, is, well, how do we know, or how can we prove that there are objective moral values and duties? Now, here's what I talked about at the beginning. In the absence of a defeater against objective moral values and duties, I think we are rational to trust our perceptions and our sense of morality. the way in which we live, right? It's like living in a matrix. I can't prove that I'm not in a matrix, just like I may not be able to prove there's objective morality. But unless you can show me why I should distrust my sense experience or why I should distrust my moral experience, then I think it is rational to believe that morality is real, just like the world outside of me is real, and just like my childhood was real. I think that this is based on the idea that most of us recognize that sexual abuse of another person is actually wrong. Like there's things that are actually wrong. Actions like rape or torture or child abuse. This is brutality and this is unacceptable behavior. Why? Because you are taking away from that life. You're doing something that goes against a good. You're not loving. If love is that objective moral value, then our duties are to love and not hurt. And therefore, we also recognize that things like love, generosity, equality, self-sacrifice, these things really are good. I think this is built into all of us that we just know it. I think where the difference is going to come is for the atheist to say, well, how do we justify it? I think we all know it. Do we say, well, that's just my opinion? Well, I think it is your opinion. You do have an opinion about it. The question is that all it is? But we all recognize that it's at least an opinion because it's something that is built into us. And just because others, and I think this is an important point, just because others see it differently, just because others may not value the same thing, should not cause us to question what we can clearly see, right? If I can clearly see the sky is blue and some person says, well, I think the sky is red, I don't go, well, maybe it is red. It's like, just because your eyes might be broken doesn't mean I'm going to start questioning what I can clearly see. Now, is everything clear? No, of course not. But I think that we can make sense of it. So in the book, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. I think that Frank Turek and Norm Geisler co-authored this book. I think he does a pretty good job on page 172. If you're interested, you can grab this, pick up 172, at laying 8 reasons why we know that there are objective moral values. And again, I'll start filtering through your questions here in a moment, or you can call into the show. But he says, number 1, moral law is undeniable, that we recognize there are moral laws. We know this, number 2, by our reactions, right? Look at how someone, we often say, what someone believes, not by what they say or what they even do, but how they react. Right? When you steal their car, they go, hey, you can't do that. Not just I don't like it, but no, this is actually a wrong. This is my private property that you should not take. And so we recognize how people react, what is really built in deeply to them. We recognize that morality is a basis for human rights. Without objective morality, objective value of life, there is no such thing as human rights, something that pretty much all of culture depends upon. And the very thing that we often use to argue when violations of human rights happen. He says, number 4, we know that objective morality exists because there's an unchanging standard of justice of we need to punish wrong and protect good. Now, again, we may disagree, or cultures may have different opinions on exactly what is a wrong or a good, but there's a deeper objective value of justice, of punishing wrong, protecting good, and that doesn't change. We recognize, number 5, that there's a real difference between moral positions. For example, like between Mother Teresa and Hitler, there's actually a difference between what they did, not just an opinion, but a moral difference. Number 6, he says, we know that absolute wrong, there must be an absolute moral standard of rightness. So if there's actually something wrong, there has to be a standard. Number 7, the moral law is the ground for political and social dissent. And number 8, if there's no moral law, then we wouldn't make excuses for violating it. Now, where he finishes after these 8 parts is talking about some confusions. And I think this, again, is kind of what I've hit on. Number 1, there's a confusion between absolute morals and changing behavior. This is often the conversation I have on the show, is people talk about how behaviors have changed. True. Behaviors have changed. There's one time we owned slaves and now we don't own slaves. Absolutely, behaviors change. But just because behaviors change does not mean that absolute morals change. Right. And so if you're going to push against an objective morality, or if the person you're talking to is pushing against objective morality, they would actually have to show how the absolute morals are changing, not just the behaviors are changing. There's also, he talks about confusion of absolute morals versus changing perception of the facts, just how we perceive the fact to be versus the fact itself. We may have confusion on how to apply it in a particular situation. This is like what came up last week of like, what about the war in Palestine? Like, how do we do that? And there's all these different people who have different opinions on how do we apply it. But we all recognize that bombing innocent people for the sake of mere pleasure is wrong, right? One side is going to justify it and say, well, here's why we bombed them. And the reason why they're trying to justify it is we all recognize bombing innocent people for just simply kicks and giggles is wrong. So there is an absolute moral foundation, which is why some of us go, hey, what you did was wrong. And why they say, well, hold on a second, I have a reason. You don't have to present a reason if it's all just relative. All they say is, well, I wanted to. Why are you upset? That's what I want to do. I get you're mad, but you can't say I'm wrong for doing this. And so the fact that something is hard to apply in a particular situation doesn't mean there's not objective morals to go to. So what is true is different from how do we live this out, or how is it practiced? And there might be disagreements about morality. He says confusion number 5, there might be moral disagreements, but that again is not evidence that there's not objective morality. So there's other confusions there. I want to stop talking. I've been talking long enough. I want to get to your questions, but I think that this is sometimes helpful in saying, look, everything we do is based upon a foundation that there is these objective, transcendent, moral values of life, love, care, these sort of things that are good. We recognize it is good to love. And therefore, we then respond appropriately when people act in a hateful way to say, hey, stop, you're wrong. And to hold to a view that says objective morality does not exist, I think is to push against that core fundamental knowledge that all of us have. And so the question is, if you're going to accept that those sort of values that we have, like I started the show, right? I started the show with saying, look, are these values that guide your life, that we hold so dear, that inform the decisions that we make, are they just simply social conventions, like drive on the right or left side of the road? Or like sports rules, do I kick the ball or throw the ball or hold the ball with my hands, or do I kick it with my feet? And therefore it's just irrelevant. And whoever made it up, that's what you do. Or is it just simply a matter of personal preference and taste? Like, I like this food and not that food. I like this flavor and not that flavor. Or are we actually saying, and what I'm arguing for, is that we all know deep down that these values are valid independent of what we think about them, that life is a basic good. And that's why then when someone violates life, when someone harms life, we say, hey, you should not do that. There's now a moral obligation of what we should and should not do. And now if you don't believe in God and you believe that there are these independently valid objective values and objective duties of things we ought and ought not do, the question then becomes, how do we ground that? How do we make sense of that? And that's where the moral argument comes in and says, look, if there is no God, then there are no objective moral values and duties. We recognize there are objective moral values and duties, therefore there is a God. And that would be the moral argument for God's existence. So with that, I think this is a helpful ethics and moral reasoning. I thought it was really interesting. Again, gave me a few things to think about. Hopefully I gave those things back to you here in a way that was engaging. How do Christians look, and what is the intellectual Christian tradition when it comes to ethics and moral reasoning? And it's not just, hey, this is what I want to do, let's do it. It goes back far. So with that, let me get back to questions again. If you want to call in. If not, I'm going to scroll through as quick as I can because I know a lot of comments came in. Appreciate that. I'm going to scroll through and see what I can find. Hamobu Mirza says here, something does not have to be objective to be important. Something is important simply because I don't want to suffer. Again, so I would say you're right. You don't want to suffer. But is your life objectively valuable to where if someone causes you to suffer, what they're doing is wrong? I think that's the big thing. Is I'm not saying you can't have something important to someone. That's clearly not my argument, right? And that's how I'm not saying that if morality is relative, then nothing is important. Well, clearly people hold things are important. I think coffee is important, but I wouldn't say that you have to drink coffee. There's no moral value in coffee. There's no moral obligation in drinking coffee, but coffee is really important to me because I really like it. So clearly importance is not what is at stake here. The question is there a moral duty that someone else has, Mirza, that says, hey, you should not harm or cause Mirza to suffer, that is actually wrong because he is valuable, even if that person doesn't think that you are. And I think that's the question. And if relativism is true, the question is, by what way can we say that what they're doing is actually a wrong? I think that's the bigger question that I want to think about here. All right, let me continue going through the questions here. John Rodriguez. How do I control the hate in my heart for people who abuse children via gender affirming care or otherwise? I think, look, while this answer is not maybe going to fix the problem, I think there's a good human emotion to hate evil, right? That when we see horrible evil done, there is a natural human emotion. And I think it's a good human emotion to say, oh, I hate that. Now, here's what I think that we can do as Christians, and here's what we should do. How does Jesus often say? Right? Jesus says, rather than removing the speck or seeing the speck in your brother's eye, first take the log out of your own eye before you see the speck in your brother's eye. What we recognize as Christians is that we all stand condemned at the foot of the cross, right? Think about the parable that Jesus told about the unforgiving servant, where the king forgave the first guy of tons of money. He went out and found someone who had owed him a little bit of money, and he was unwilling to forgive that person. And so when we think about that parable, and when we think about that there was a time in which God was merciful to us when our backs were turned against him, and he was merciful to me, how can I not go and show the same mercy to others? Now, right, just because we are supposed to show mercy, that doesn't mean we say, yay, good job, everything's okay. Right? I have shows a long time ago, podcast only, and I can post it in the comment section. I interviewed my mom. My mom wrote a book called Desperate Hope, the story of a guy breaking into our house, holding a knife at my mom's neck, attempting to rape and kill my mother. And my mom escaped. Crazy story. Through the power of prayer, she started just praying, God, bind the power of Satan in this man. Let him know that you love him, that you care about him, that you don't want him to destroy his life doing this thing. And the guy literally, while the knife was pointed at my mom, froze, stopped moving. My mom's like, I think now's the time to run. And so she dipped under his arm, run out the front door. Whole series of events took place. Years and years later, she wants to write this story into a book. And the publisher says, you need to find that guy. And so through searching, she found the guy. He had become a Christian in jail. So he went to jail. He bound to become a Christian. And my mom interviewed him to hear his side of the story, and wrote his side of the story paired with her side of the story in the book, Desperate Hope. And he actually said, when you started to pray, I could not move. I don't know what happened. I couldn't move. And I think here's the question. Is my mom's response to that evil, he tried to rape and kill my mom, is her response to say, I now hate you and I will never forgive you? Well, she talks about in the book that would have put herself, while he would have been in a literal prison, that would have put her in a prison of unforgiveness, or that would have been controlling her. Rather than being able to say, God, you will handle him better than I ever could. Right? I forget where in scripture, but God says, vengeance is mine. I will repay, says the Lord. And I think a lot of times the hate that we hold on to is thinking that we need justice. We need vengeance. I need to get even. Rather than saying, number one, I'm called to forgive. I'm called to love. I'm not Jesus. I'm not God. And God is the one that says, vengeance is mine, I will repay. I will get, because God, in God's view, he is just. Justice will happen. And as a Christian who believes that there's true justice, I think I now can say, okay, God, you got this. That doesn't mean I celebrate evil, but that also doesn't mean I have to hold that hatred myself and unforgiveness myself. I think from a non-Christian perspective, from a secular perspective, if there is no afterlife, if there is no God, then there are legitimate cases in which justice never takes place. It never happens. People can be wickedly evil their entire lives and never get punished. And some people can be really good and die young and very unfortunate. And it seems unjust. And so I think from a secular perspective, there might be more of a drive to, I need to make sure I get even, that he gets what he deserves, or else he may get off the hook. In a Christian perspective, that's just not going to happen. And so I think that's how I try to control myself, is recognizing God was merciful to me. How do I not be merciful to others? God is the judge. I'm not. While he has called us to make judgments and recognize that harming children is wrong, I think that's one way that we can control it, to where we can have hate for an action, but hopefully that doesn't turn into hatreds in our heart, as we are called to love our enemies. Hopefully that helps. That's a really good question, John. Thank you. Thank you for sending that in. Mirza again, if morality comes from God's nature and homosexuality is morally wrong, why are some people born gay? So Mirza, I would ask you why you make this statement that people are born gay. I've looked at every study I can find, or that has been sent to me, or that is referenced in trying to make this argument. We have no study at all showing that people are born gay. There's nothing scientifically, there's no gay gene, there's no whatever that may be. I would argue that we don't have scientific confirmation that people are born gay. Now then people often respond and go, whoa, so you're just saying, Ryan, that you think people choose to be gay? Well, no, not either, right? And that's what Christians often say. Well, if they're not born that way, then they chose it. So then just stop it. Well, it doesn't work that way either. I have good friends of mine who have same-sex attraction and they don't want it. And they're not just choosing it. They don't want it. They pray to all this sort of stuff. And so I would argue that there's a nature and nurture component, and that sexual orientation is something that develops at a young age that we are not conscious of or aware of, but it's not necessarily determined by our genes. But it is not something that we choose, where, I often ask straight people, like, when did you choose to be straight? When did you wake up and say, today I think I'm going to like girls or guys? It's like, well, I didn't. I noticed one day that I do. And so that's what I would argue is I would just push back against the question and say, if you're going to argue that if homosexuality is morally wrong, why are some people born gay? How would you defend, I guess, the statement that people are born that way versus it is more of a nurture thing? Now, even if some people are born that way, does that mean, therefore, any way in which I am born, therefore, becomes a good? Now, people will argue that things like alcoholism has a genetic component. Just because it has a genetic component, would we think that alcoholism and drunkenness becomes a good thing because there's a genetic component? People have argued in the opposite framework that if someone was born with like a hateful gene, if we somehow discovered that there was a hate gene that just caused you to hate people and just always beat them up, would we argue, well, because there's a genetic component and they were born with the hate gene, therefore it's good to do that? Or we would say, no, there's something horribly broken. And so I don't think that the genetic argument points back to something being objectively right or wrong. So, all right, I don't see any initial questions here. There's a lot of comments. And Lou, I see that you just called in. So I'm just scanning to the bottom really quick. And I love all the questions that people are asking. Oh, there's a question from James. So let me stop here from that question from James. And, well, this may take us to the end of the show. But I always try to prioritize callers, and I think that callers are fun. Chat with you again. How you doing?
Hi, you there?
I am here.
All right. Just wanted to say I caught part of, the study you were doing on morality and all that. And just wanted to ask you a couple things.
Yeah.
One is, I know you value reading a lot, and you're very educated because you do read a lot of authors. Right? Do you ever read secular authors on their take on these very same issues? Or is it just Christian authors that you read?
No, I try my best to read a wide range. So I often say, for example, when I was doing my doctoral studies on gender identity, I read the affirming side, I read the non-affirming side, I read theologians, both affirming theologians and non-affirming theologians. I read psychologists, historians, reporters, journalists, all the different sides. I often say, and this is true, every book that an atheist has ever recommended me, I've read. So I had an atheist say, the only reason you deny evolution is because you haven't read about it. You should read Jerry Coyne's book, Why Evolution is True. And I said, sounds good. And so I bought the book and I read it right away. And so I try to read as much as I can. Now, because of my interests and because of my doctoral studies, now while there is a wide range of issues, so I'm reading a book right now written by an atheist, on culture and his approach to culture. So that's part of my doctoral work, is trying to get a wide branch, because a lot of the interviews I do are with Christian authors. It often kind of maybe skews in that direction, but I do try my best to kind of get a wide range.
I'm really glad to hear that, because that means that you are at least hearing from, both sides of that issue. And that's very important, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I make an attempt to listen and look at Christian material quite often. I do it more so than I do any secular material. I actually want to hear, what's out there. And the only other thought I had was, when you're talking about, morality, right? I think I commented on one of your posts. I don't see how it matters if somebody thinks morality is objective or subjective. In our everyday lives, I don't think anyone is asking that question generally. It's a philosophical question, right? I don't know people who are going around thinking of morality and going, well, let me see if that's objective morality or not. They're just living their lives. Right? And, the question of whether it's objective or subjective is a philosophical one that doesn't really have a stopping point. It goes on, and it doesn't matter. That's the thing I don't understand, like why Christians make it this big thing. It doesn't even matter. There are atheists who believe in objective morality. There are atheists that do not believe in objective morality, and it doesn't impact their lives. So I'm just wondering why you think, or is it even important for someone to believe in objective morality from a Christian perspective?
I think it's a really good question. Thank you. Two thoughts come to mind initially. Number one is, I think it's less important on what they necessarily believe. The question is, to me, is how are they living? Right? Because if someone is just going around wreaking havoc because they're like, well, I don't think anything's wrong with just murdering people, and so I'm just going to murder as much as I want, then obviously we have an issue with it. Right. And so that's why, there's a lot of videos online that someone says, well, I don't care if someone thinks they're 6'5" or if they're a man or a woman. Like, I don't care. And it's like, well, yeah, in one sense, I don't care if someone is 5'10" and they think they're 6'5". Like, I really just don't care. The question is, when do those beliefs start having an impact on society around us? And so I think number one that we recognize is that these beliefs and values that people have often then drive or the foundation that drive our behaviors and our actions, where we see people have been owned as slaves, where we see women mistreated in the Me Too movement, where we see immigrants being talked down about, where we see, minorities being discriminated against. We see all of these injustices in society. And the question becomes, well, is it wrong to discriminate against minorities? Is it wrong to misuse women because they are whatever, because they're not men and men are stronger? And so when we see these injustices done, the conversation does come up in the sense of asking, well, is what that person did actually wrong? Is it wrong to abuse women, or is it just something that we just don't like as a society? Can we actually say this law is a bad or an unjust law? I think that this then becomes the foundation for our justice system. Is it just to send someone to jail for doing something that wasn't actually wrong? And I think that would be unjust to say, well, I didn't like what you did, and so you're going to jail. And so I think that's where this conversation firstly comes into important, is that it becomes important is because these values that we hold often do play themselves out in our actions. And so if someone is holding to things like life being good and human dignity being good and all these things being good, but they think everything's subjective. In one sense, it doesn't really matter. It just matters of what they think the values are. That would be my first answer. The second answer would be in the apologetic conversation, where if you're going to make an argument, like I would on a moral argument for God's existence, that if God does not exist, then objective morality is not possible. Then I think this does become an important conversation, because we can use our moral awareness of objective moral values and duties to actually then make an argument for God's existence, and helping people who are questioning whether God exists and if there's any good reason to believe in him, that there is a reason based on morality. So those would be the two, I think, reasons why it can be an important conversation.
One one thing, and I'm gonna go because I want you to have time for other people, but just personal observation. I look at Christian content a lot, right? So it's not like it's a big thing. I watch lots of content, all right, and I also see atheist content or secular content, and like on one issue, a moral issue would be slavery. And what I see over and over is Christians defending, the institution of slavery, or even, they don't like that word. So they'll go indentured servitude, right? And they'll defend it. And to me, I don't think that's moral at all. Okay. So I don't understand. I watch secular people and atheist thinkers that can tell you straight up slavery is evil. It's not something we should ever have in any society. All right. And then I see on the other side Christians saying, well, maybe it's okay. Well, in this situation, it's okay. It's like, to me, you're not on the moral high ground on that issue. It's like you're not on the high ground at all on certain moral issues. So, I mean, I know I don't base my morality on a God, but I certainly believe slavery is wrong in all situations. And I think indentured servitude is wrong. Okay. So I don't, how does it really play out? Like, Christians more moral than anybody else? It doesn't seem like it. Christians fill the jail cells. Christians commit crime. Christians get abortions. All right. They're against abortion, and yet more people get abortions that are Christian than anybody else. Divorce. Christians get divorced at a very high rate. Atheists are a much lower rate of divorce. Now, not that this means any of it's true, but I mean, where are these Christians coming from when they say they're on this moral high ground? And it's like, really? You're living a moral high ground as a group? You're getting divorced as much, if not more, than other people. You're getting abortions as much, as not more, as other people. So I don't get this moral thing with the Christians.
Yeah. So I maybe would push back on some of the stats a little bit. I think what you're saying though is true, that if we are saying that we are somehow on this moral high ground, and that because I am a Christian, therefore I am more moral than anybody else, and I'm better than all of you, and you atheists are horrible scum, and you can't do anything good. I mean, I kind of pushed against that in my video where I had a call from a Christian on Friday that said non-believers, non-Christians cannot be good. I push back against that, and I think that's wrong. And so I would not say that I'm on some sort of moral high ground. I'm speaking more philosophically here, saying, can objective moral values and duties be grounded in a worldview in which God does not exist? I think that Christians can ground objective moral values. I think we can actually say, because Christianity is true, love is good and hate is bad. And that is only possible within a Christian worldview. If there's no God, I don't think you can make that statement. That, though, doesn't mean that every single Christian is loving and all non-Christians are hateful. In fact, there's a lot of Christians that hate. And that's where I think we then can call Christians out and say, hold on, you're being hypocrites, you're being inconsistent. And that's how my first sentence of the show was, we all have values that determine our behavior. While we may not consistently follow those values, we have these sort of values. And so that's how I would push it. And so I would agree with you in that sense. Now, I'm just kind of curious. And
I appreciate you, Ryan. All right. I do. I love watching, what you're talking about. And I think it's wonderful. All right. Think about this thing, though, with moral, objective morality. Think about secular people who also think they have objective morality.
Yeah.
Because there's many secular people, including atheists that are well known, like Sam Harris, I think, believes in objective morality.
Absolutely.
Okay? So there's different angles that they come at it, right?
So can I ask two quick questions? Because I do have to run, but can I ask two quick questions? Because I love talking with you, and I'm curious about two things. and we can maybe try to make this quick. Do you have to go? I can take a couple
Real
minutes.
quick. Go ahead. I'll be real quick.
So number one, you mentioned that you think that all indentured servitude is wrong. I'm curious why exactly, if you can make that quick. Because as I understand, maybe just put it this way, as I understand, indentured servitude can be working for a period without pay to pay off a debt. So in a simplistic sense, it's, Lou, you have a car that I want and it costs $10,000. I don't have $10,000. And so you say, hey, Ryan, you can work for me for 6 months and the car is yours. And so I work for you. I'm not getting paid, but I'm getting paid to work off a debt that I owe you, which is the $10,000 car. And so if we make a contract where I work for you for 6 months and in return I get the car, what do you think is immoral about that? Or would you define it differently?
Okay, I think it's immoral because it's not an acceptable way to conduct business today. So culturally, it's immoral. In today's world, to say, well, I have an indentured servant, it's not something most people would consider moral.
So would you then say it's better? Would you then say it's better for me to go to the bank, get a $10,000 loan, pay that loan off, and then I have to go work for someone else to make money to then pay off the bank? So in a sense, I am a servant to the bank. I'm owing the debt to the bank instead of you.
That's far better, because in the indentured servant world or model, you are owned by that person. They're taking your freedom away. It's not just you're working as an employee somewhere. An indentured servant is not an employee, and it's not a business relationship with a bank. It is more than that. It is owning another person for 6, 7, 8 years or whatever your contract is. And there are bad contracts. And
for sure. Absolutely.
Contracts. So if someone's going to say, Ryan, you're going to pay off your debt to me, and I'm going to make you do all this weird stuff. All right. And you signed it. You did sign it, and we agreed. It still stinks.
Oh, absolutely. I would agree with that. There's bad things that people can get pressured into. And so that's why I think also consent is a bad standard, because just because I consent doesn't mean I can't have external pressures that cause me to consent to things that are bad. And so I would agree there. Right. Yeah, absolutely. So, I think there could be wrong versions of it. Now, my last quick question to you is, you mentioned consider atheists that have or believe in objective morality. So I fully agree that there are atheists like Sam Harris that do believe and recognize there being objective morality. My argument would be, I haven't seen an atheist that believes in objective morality that I think can provide an objective foundation or a grounding for that view. It's definitely a view that they hold. And then I say, okay, how do you make sense of it in a world in which there is no God? And that's where I think it kind of falls apart. So I'm curious if you have heard a good atheistic argument or a secular argument for objective morality. What do you think is a way in which to ground or make sense of objective moral values and duties within an atheistic system, or what atheists have hold to? Is there one that you found persuasive, especially persuasive?
It has to do with society and groupthink. All right. And that people come to a consensus, and that becomes the objective part of it. So it's could their consensus be different? No. Society, right, as a whole comes up with standards, all right, and we live by those standards. Otherwise, we go to jail and all that stuff, right? But you could have something like you shall not murder other people, and that can be your objective standard on the issue of murder. And can
another society see murder as good?
Doesn't mean that a God said that, or that it's ultimately an objective standard that works well within a society. So it's not the same as when a Christian says they have an objective standard. So I don't think Sam Harris's objective standard is the same as Ryan's.
So, but the question is,
I do think he has an objective standard.
Yeah. Well, the question is, could a different society be different?
Always.
Okay, then it's not objective in the sense that there isn't anything that transcends both societies, which is the ground by which they determine their laws. Their laws become objective only in the sense that that's the rule for them, but those rules can change and those rules could be different. Therefore, it becomes a cultural relativism.
It's not universal. All right.
Okay, so that's how I would use the term objective.
Necessarily have to say universal. I think it's a little different view of what we call objective morality. So
Okay.
I do think it's a little different. All right. There's a little difference there, but you're talking about the usage of words and how they apply. And ultimately, it's what I said at the beginning of this conversation. It pretty much doesn't matter, because you could be a Christian and believe God's morality is objective, and you could completely disobey. So it doesn't matter because you're a subjective actor. You're a person who subjectively will do what you please. You have that free will, right? So even in practice, it doesn't matter. That's why I don't know why it's even a big issue. It's not an issue that I even spend time thinking about. Is there objective morality or not? I've thought about it, but it doesn't play a role in my life at all. I think have morality still.
Well, I think it matters when all of a sudden someone walks into your house and starts taking your stuff. Then all of a sudden you say, hey, that's mine. You should not do that, as if you have a right to that property that's yours, and them taking your stuff is a violation of your rights. That's when all of a sudden it matters, is when you lock your door at night because you don't want people coming in and taking your stuff because that's your stuff and you think it's wrong. That's when it matters, I think.
But it can be subjective. I mean, I don't need to have an absolute. I mean, I'm trusting my own mind. All right. I don't need to have an absolute.
No. Well,
right? Even if I had an absolute, like a Bible, I'm still interpreting that book. I'm still thinking, well, how does that apply to me? It's not an absolute as I think Christians think it is. I mean, even though you have an absolute, it doesn't matter in your day-to-day life.
Yeah.
You're still going to subjectively do the things you do. in a Brooklyn way, that's it. You're going to do the things you do.
So as always, I'll give you the last word. I just think where it matters is that when you start putting moral duties on other people and saying, you should not steal my stuff, or you should do this, if all that is my opinion, and if morality is relative, if it's not absolute, and that's just my preference and my opinion, and I'm forcing my opinion on that person, I think that's wrong. And rather than saying, no, I'm telling you what to do because that's what you ought to do. There's something that it's not just my opinion. I'm not just making my opinion get forced on you and then sending you to jail for violating my opinion. What you actually did was wrong. And so that's where I think the conversation does matter, is not just what can I say, but is it fair to lock someone in jail for violating my opinion if they didn't actually do anything wrong? But if they came into my house, took my stuff, they've done something wrong, now I think it's fair to punish them because what they've done actually violates a objective moral standard. And so anyways, I'll give you the last word if there's anything you want to say to comment on that. But that's where I think that becomes important.
The only thing I would say, just to think about, is God himself would have a subjective morality because he'd have to have thought through these things and made something. And even if that's the case, it's still kind of subjective in God's world, because he can, but whatever. I just don't think it matters much.
Okay.
That's my
fair enough.
Point. I
appreciate it, Lou. You give me stuff to think about. And everyone else that calls in, you always give me stuff to think about, and I do appreciate it. And it's also these conversations that you all make me think that when I am reading my books, that I'm processing through and thinking, okay, even when I read Christian authors and Christian apologists, I'm like, okay, are they answering the questions that I get and the ones that people are asking? And
you get some tough ones, Ryan.
I appreciate you guys.
I appreciate you. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Lou. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye. All right, with that, everybody, appreciate you being here. Again, next week is going to be the science of creation, Adam and Eve, with Dr. Fuzz Rana. The week after that is going to be our part one of apologetic study on natural theology, Dr. Charles Taliaferro. Then the February 11, our part 2 of our culture study on abortion. Then February 18, part 2 of our worldview study on the great tradition of Christian thinking. And so those are the next 4 shows. Hopefully they are enjoyable. Hopefully you learn a lot. I learn a lot. I have fun. I love chatting with you guys. I love being here with you. This is an absolute blast. So thank you for making this fun for me, and hopefully it's fun for all of you to listen to. Sorry about all the technical issues at the beginning of the show. I don't know what was happening, but if you didn't see them, it's because I edited those out, and you luckily skipped that whole ordeal. So with that, if you appreciate what this show is, consider liking, subscribing, share it. There's other videos that are going to pop up here on YouTube to help you think well about the Christian faith and the culture around you, because these things are worth thinking about. So until next week, see you everybody. And again, subscribe or follow on Instagram, Ryan Pauly 3. I have a channel there that you can chat about all these things throughout the week and ask questions, and it's a blast. So anyways, have a good one, and I will see you next week, everybody. Bye.